recruit 50 million youths into the army and take away from their recruitment source. What they will eat? Cassava, àgbàdo, corn in the morning, yam in the afternoon. It's growing here. You create demand and consumption.
On October 11, 1990, federal agents from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration knocked on the front door of 460 Taft Place in the city of Gary, Indiana. Once a booming steel town with a population approaching 180,000 in 1960, Gary was one of a number of cities and towns across the U.S. suffering from severe population loss, among other adverse effects of overseas competition on their mainstay industries. From having over 30,000 employees at its peak in 1970, the city's main employer, U.S. Steel Gary Works, retained just 6,000 employees in 1990. Under these circumstances, this city and its 77% African-American population were witnessing explosive growth in one of the only industries guaranteed to boom under such difficult circumstances. 42-year-old Lee Andrew Edwards was one of the entrepreneurs who had found a place in the heroin trafficking business, and by all accounts, he had done very well for himself. With the proceeds from his illegal business, he had bought 2 residential homes, including 460 Taft Place, an apartment building, a liquor store, and a new car, all paid for with cash. Now, according to court records from the United States Court of Appeals 7th Circuit, the DEA agents arrived at the property to execute a search warrant after a 7-month FBI investigation involving Edwards' brother, Jimmy, had implicated him as the narcotics kingpin of Gary. Edwards did not open the door for the agents, who were forced to break into the house. He then fired 3 gunshots at them, after which he surrendered. DEA agents found weapons including a carbine rifle, thousands of dollars in cash, drug prepping equipment including a triple beam scale, and several grams of cocaine and heroin powder in the house. He was later sentenced to life in prison, but not before something about his business operation came to the fore. Federal investigators had determined that Edwards' heroin supply came from a Nigerian drug dealer in Chicago called Abiodun Agbele. Abiodun had earlier agreed to work for the feds in exchange for lighter sentencing, and as part of the plea deal, he revealed everything he knew about the heroin trade in Chicago. Located at the junction of 4 states with a combined population exceeding 27 million at the time, Chicago was a key trafficking hub in the American heroin trade, and as it turned out, the wholesale trade of an especially potent form of heroin from Southeast Asia in 1990 Chicago was controlled by Nigerian criminal gangs. The following excerpt is taken from the January 2001 Illinois Drug Threat Assessment published by the U.S. Justice Department's National Drug Intelligence Center. Nigerian criminal groups are responsible for wholesale distribution of most of the SEA heroin shipped into Chicago. SEA heroin, which is 80 to 90% pure, is being sold by Nigerian traffickers for $80,000 to $110,000 per kilogram. Wholesalers in Chicago usually sell heroin without cutting it to minimize the handling of the product and their exposure to law enforcement. Now, Agbele himself was no criminal mastermind, however. As he testified under oath, that honor belonged to a man who went by the name of Adegboyega Muiz Akonde, who was apparently his uncle. Shortly after Agbele's arrival in the US, Akonde had taken him under his wing and showed him the ropes of wholesale heroin trafficking. When Akonde returned to Nigeria in mid-1990, Agbele was left in charge of selling regular heroin shipments from Nigeria to Lee Edwards and delivering the profits to his uncle. In the meantime, the Nigerian-led heroin trade in Chicago fed an addiction epidemic that became so bad that it changed local health and law enforcement practices. For the first time, providing addicts with free access to safe syringes and needles to ensure that they did not share them and possibly spread HIV became a core focus of public health policy. In other words, SEA heroin from Nigeria was so potent and addictive that public health policy in Chicago shifted away from trying to make heroin addicts stop using altogether to merely ensuring that they used safely. A notable organization that did such outreach work with heroin addicts was the Chicago Recovery Alliance. While researching this story, I reached out to its current executive director, John Werning, to get a sense of how the heroin epidemic changed law enforcement practices from the 1990s to date in Chicago. And his comments were very predictably grim. He said, "Heroin, of course, has consequences. But I think we would probably say that the more major impact is the draconian laws around how heroin was policed. I think that it's pretty well established that there was a very specific targeting of folks who use drugs generally, but also heroin in particular, and it was mostly targeted toward the policing of black and brown communities. That's not specific to Chicago. I think that's across the nation. But just in general, I think there was a lack of compassion by government entities to give people access to the treatment that they need, or non-violent drug possession and mandatory minimum sentencing. I mean, there's a ton of different aspects of this that absolutely eviscerated populations, particularly marginalized populations in Chicago, and that's probably the advocate's view on this. Now, whether or not that can be translated into a comment about the international drug trade, and specifically from, you said, Nigeria, I just don't know. But that's definitely more like domestic politics than international. Now, while all of this is going on, there was an interesting subplot taking place in the background. An accountant living in the Chicago area who worked for Mobil Oil Nigeria with a declared monthly income of $2,400 had just deposited over $1.4 million in the bank. He had no known source of income apart from his day job, but he had become friends with Akonde and Agbede, discovering one key piece of information in the process: drug dealers need accountants too. Soon, he will find himself holding and wiring money on behalf of a Nigerian heroin gang in Chicago. Fast forward a little bit to January 1992, and he will find himself the subject of a US federal investigation. Fast forward a bit further in the same year, and he would successfully run for office in Nigeria as a senator for Lagos West. Then another politician, also said to have ties to international drug trafficking, would successfully run for president in Nigeria on a controversial all-Muslim ticket in 1993. The election will be annulled, the politician will be jailed, and ultimately another Nigerian military coup will take place in 1994. This accountant would find himself exiled and working with the National Democratic Coalition, NADECO, to unseat a kleptocrat military dictator. Then the dictator would unexpectedly drop dead one day in 1998, followed in quick succession by the jailed politician with the alleged drug links. This accountant would return to Nigeria a hero and successfully run for governor of Lagos in 1999. The kleptocrat dictator's erstwhile bagman, who helped launder over $4 billion, would become the accountant's new best friend, as an erstwhile Chicago drug gang's loader would start his new lifetime mission of capturing Africa's largest subnational economy and turning it into his personal fiefdom. A major political opponent of the accountant would end up strangled to death in his bedroom 10 months to an election which his chosen candidate would go on to win. Said opponent's son would subsequently be offered a cushy job working for that candidate. He would accept the offer. And if you're already struggling to follow this unlikely sequence of events, don't worry, it gets worse. A US district court would seem like an odd place to begin this story, but this is no ordinary story. The main character in this story is an individual whose entire existence is as puzzlingly mysterious as it is loud and public. For at least 30 years, Bola Ahmed Tinubu has been at or near the grinding phase of frontline politics in Nigeria. Yet the peak 1 inch below the surface reveals just how little is actually known about this man, who some say is Nigeria's president in waiting. First of all, there is the age controversy. How old is the man really? What is his real date of birth? Short answer, no one actually knows. Like many Nigerians born into the less than auspicious circumstances that characterized his childhood in Iragbiji in Osun State, southwestern Nigeria, he himself may not even know. Similar controversy exists around what his actual name is. A popular theory is that Bola Ahmed Tinubu is an identity that he transitioned into at some point after moving to Lagos to live with his surrogate mother, Alhaja Abibatu Mogaji. The only thing every version of his life story has in common is that for the first 2 decades or so, he was apparently invisible and unmemorable. There are no childhood friends, there are no classmates, there are no neighbors, there are no colleagues that remember him. Sometime in the mid-1970s, however, he somehow materialized at the international airport in Lagos, holding a passport with a US visa and a one-way ticket to Chicago in hand. From his arrival in Chicago in 1975, his story then becomes easier to track and verify. So what do we know about this guy? We know that he spent 2 years gaining an associate degree at